everyone, I'm so glad you're joining us for another episode of Everybody, a place we host conversations about food and bodies. I'm Daria Matza, and welcome. Last year, 108 million Americans went on diets, but long-term studies consistently find that these dieters are more likely to end up gaining weight in the next 2 to 15 years than people who don't diet. Today we're talking with Dr. Sandra Aamodt, neuroscientist, researcher, and author of Why Diets Make Us Fat. She spent 3 decades in her own punishing cycle of starvation and weight gain before turning her scientific eye to the research on weight and health. I talked to her on Skype at her Northern California home, where she lives on 8 acres with her husband, dog, and 2 cats. The combination of her personal story and science background gives a unique perspective on why diets fail.
My personal story goes back pretty much my entire life. I started dieting, as I said, in both the book and the TED Talk when I was 13 and lost the same weight over and over again for decades. It's really amazing looking back on it to think, oh, well, how did I do that? How did I regain that weight? Must have been 30 or 40 times. And never had it occur to me that it was anything but my fault. And that, because of that experience, when I first came across the science, it made a lot of sense to me immediately, as it does to a lot of people when I mention it to people that, your body wants to be a certain weight and has all kinds of tricks to get you to go back to it. Women especially, many of them say, oh, right. Yeah, of course, that makes total sense with my own experience. It's just an amazing brainwashing job that our culture has done on us to make us all believe that somehow this was all our personal failings, even though it's happening to so many of us so much of the time.
Were you already interested in being a scientist outside of that? And then at some point they converge? How did that happen?
I already had a PhD and was a neuroscientist and had been for years when I got interested in this particular aspect of it. So I got my PhD in 1998, and it was 8 or 10 years later that I started getting interested in this science.
It seems so important, too, to have your kind of background. I know you used to review a lot of research work and peer review, so having that eye to look at the research instead of just seeing the news headlines. Is there advice you give to people that don't have that scientific background on how to approach material that they see and differentiate it from a fad or garbage?
Yeah, I have some basic rules that I give to people. One of them is do not pay any attention to studies that only run for 6 months or a year, unless yo-yo dieting is what you're aiming for, because there are literally thousands upon thousands of ways that people have shown that you can lose some weight temporarily. It's not really very hard to do. All the problems come on the back end after the scientists have picked up their data and gone back to the lab and left the people who were in the study on their own. I'm not entirely upset with scientists for this because it really is very hard to get funding to maintain a study for years and years. But in this field, that's where almost all the interesting stuff is going on. And it's a shame that there are so few studies that go out far enough to actually show us what's happening there.
So for those who haven't read your book, can you explain what those longer term studies show in terms of dieting?
All the long-term studies that we have that go out for more than about 2 years show that people typically reach the lowest weight that they're going to reach on a diet somewhere between 6 and 12 months after starting the diet. And after that, they regain the weight. The very most successful medical intervention that has been reported to date had 27% of its participants keep 10% of their weight off for 8 years. And just about an equal number of people gained back more weight than they lost. So that means that 27% of the people who participated in the study were helped by the diet if you go with the simplistic idea that losing weight is going to improve your health, which we can get to later. It's not quite that straightforward. And 26% of the people in the study were harmed by it because they ended up gaining back more weight than they had lost. And the rest of them put in 8 years of effort and ended up right back where they'd started from.
So interesting. So from your neuroscience background, can you kind of start to explain why that happens?
It happens because weight is regulated. You don't get to choose your weight really very much more than you get to choose your height or your blood cholesterol or any of the physiological properties of your body. We can push our weight around in the short term by eating less and exercising more. But what happens in the long term when you do that is that once you get outside the range of weights that your brain thinks is acceptable for you, then this physiological reaction sets in and you get much, much hungrier, usually without realizing. So people actually have been shown to eat more and not notice that they're eating more. Some studies have suggested that people also, in similarly unconscious ways, move less. And finally, your body actually burns less energy. It becomes more fuel efficient so that you can get farther on the same number of calories. That all makes really good sense in the context of where we evolved, where food was hard to get and you had to go out and expend calories to find it. If you were starving to death in the jungle, you would be so thrilled by the prospect that you could walk an extra couple of miles looking for food today on the number of calories that you had available to burn. But in a modern society where we have food available essentially all the time now and without much effort, that reaction is not aligned with most people's goals, to say the least.
If we look at the way we've evolved, it would really served us to have this regulation. And that regulation's happening within the brain?
There's a specific part of the brain called the hypothalamus that contains the regulatory circuits that increase hunger and decrease activity and change your metabolism based on where you are relative to the range that your brain thinks is right for you. And I should mention that there actually is regulation in both directions. So people who eat too much get the reverse set of reactions. They become less hungry and their metabolism goes up. If you've ever woken up in the middle of the night really hot after a big meal, that's what that is. That's your body trying to burn off those extra calories. But the risks in our evolutionary past were not symmetrical. You know, we've had a relatively low risk in general of gaining too much weight and a relatively high risk of starving to death. And so the two sides of the regulation are also not symmetrical. The part that's designed to keep you from starving to death is much more effective, efficient, and particularly important, long-lasting than the one that's trying to keep you from gaining weight, which appears to fade completely away in a few months. Whereas, as far as anybody's been able to tell experimentally, the pressures to get you to gain back weight that you've lost essentially lasts forever. It's been measured out to 6 years.
Wow. From the first occurrence. So you go on a diet and then that desire to gain the weight back, even from that one diet, lasts for 6 years?
It lasts as long as you stay under your weight that your brain thinks is right for you.
And is that weight, that set point weight, something that's genetic?
It's partly genetic. It probably has some environmental inputs, particularly in childhood. There are various things that are correlated, we know, with people being heavier as adults. One of the less expected ones, for instance, is sleep loss as a child. Kids who don't get enough sleep are much more likely to grow up heavier, and also having many courses of antibiotics as a child, which interferes with gut bacteria that have been implicated in the weight regulation process. So there's a variety of influences. And some of them are probably more changeable in adulthood, and some of them are probably less changeable. But in general, by the time you're 25 or 30, most people's brains have a fairly strong idea of what they should weigh.
Can you talk about how that set point gets shifted by the process of dieting?
It's not entirely understood what happens, but it does seem to be fairly systematic that once people have gained weight and kept it on for a while, that the brain adjusts and says, okay, I can work with this. This is going to be our new goal. And that becomes normal. So most people gain weight sort of slowly over years. And the problem with that is that it allows your defended weight range to ratchet up over the same long period of time. It's actually relatively easy in most cases to lose weight that you've gained suddenly and for some distinct reason. If you have an episode of depression and gain 50 pounds and then you get treated and your depression goes away and you lose that weight, you're probably not in most cases going to find that your set point has been permanently changed.
So that set point, if you are chronic dieting and your weight keeps increasing over the years of your life, from what I read in your book, is there any way to get back to that original set point that your body's naturally supposed to be at, or are you kind of stuck with this new set point that your body gets used to?
As far as anybody knows, there are not any good ways to lower your set point once it becomes elevated. That's the heart of the problem. Once your set point goes up, we don't know how to get it to go back down.
You talk about how the process of calorie counting is pointless for many reasons. Can you share a little bit of that?
So the problem is that in order to keep your weight stable, you have to get that calorie counting right to within, better than 99% accuracy. And the ways that we count calories, the ways that we measure calories are rarely that accurate. Even if you're really, really careful, even if you weigh everything and write down every single thing that you eat and look every single thing up, the requirements for how precise calorie measurement has to be on package labels is only to within 20%. And if your calorie intake is off by 20%, you are going to notice it in your waistline. There's also variations in metabolism from person to person. There are a lot of takeout food places that don't even come as close as 20% in their reporting of calories. And probably won't surprise you to know that most of them undershoot the calorie estimates rather than overshooting them.
Of course, right?
Yeah.
I really loved the section in your book about gut health, and I feel like it's kind of a newer emerging research around that. Can you talk about the connection between gut health and your brain?
The problem with this area is that it's so new that we actually don't understand it well enough to make it practically useful to people. But we do understand enough to know that the population of bacteria that live in your stomach and your intestines have a very strong influence on weight. You can show that in mice by transplanting gut bacteria from one animal to another and showing that the recipient animal becomes more like the donor animal in its weight. But the problem with gut bacteria in general is that it's a whole ecosystem in there. It's not like, you have these 6 gut bacteria. You have thousands of gut bacteria across different classes, and certain ones compete with certain others. And then there's different sets that occupy a different ecological niche and don't have anything to do with each other. And our use of antibiotics is changing the population of gut bacteria, which is also clearly influencing our health. So it's really complicated. It's super interesting, and it's going to take a long time to figure it out to the point where it's actually useful to an individual. But I think it's very clear that it's important, and there are a lot of people working on it. It's going to be an area to watch for the future.
When you realized in your own path of dieting that empirically the diets don't work, what was your shift to stop dieting? Can you talk a little bit more about your personal journey with this?
I didn't stop dieting right away. There were a couple of years, actually, where I sort of tried to convince myself that this wasn't really true for me, and maybe I just needed to try harder or differently or something. And eventually I convinced myself not to stop dieting forever, but just to try it for a year and see what happened. And so I made that my New Year's resolution in 2010, that I was not going to diet, I was not going to weigh myself, and I was going to exercise every day.
Those are like your 3 resolutions?
Those were my 3 linked resolutions. And it turned out that when I stopped dieting and stopped constantly worrying about my weight, I did not gain a ton of weight. And my weight stabilized pretty much right in the middle of the range that it had gone through when I was dieting. And it's still there. Now it's almost 7 years later. With a lot less effort, a lot less work, I'm getting basically almost the same results as dieting without the cycling. I only have 1 set of clothes now. I used to have 5. I had 5 different sizes of pants for much of my adult life.
That must have been a lot of emotional stress too, I imagine. Just always feeling like you had to be in and out of sizes and...
It was an extraordinary amount of emotional overhead, and I didn't really appreciate how much it was until I stopped doing it. It was, when I was in it, it was just normal.
Right. Was it hard to stop? Was it hard to quiet the chatter around you? And
It was. It was hard both internally. There was definitely a voice in the back of my head that said, "Oh, this is a terrible mistake. You are going to gain so much weight." And also in terms of the reactions that I got from other people. I remember a conversation with a good friend where I said I was going to do this, and his immediate response was, "So you're just giving up then?"
Was there any part of you that felt relief, though, too, in that you didn't have to have that stress for the year?
For the first, I would say, month or 2, it was mostly added stress. It was really quite hard to break the habit. I had to actually remove the scale from the house and hide it. But gradually, as time went on and it became more normal and more comfortable to me, I started noticing all the things I wasn't worrying about anymore, and really started noticing how much easier it was to make other behavioral changes without this constant struggle about eating hanging over me all the time, soaking up my willpower.
It takes up so much space emotionally, and I suppose in your brain too. I also wanted to ask you, since you had mentioned it in your email, about the shift that happened with you with exercise.
That's the thing that's been most unexpected and fascinating to me. So start out with the idea that I exercised for 30 years or so because I was supposed to, even though I mostly hated it, and almost always only when I was dieting. I would go through cycles where I was dieting and exercising, and then periods where I was not doing either one until I gained enough weight back to trigger off another cycle of dieting and exercising. That had a couple of interesting effects that I, again, didn't realize until years later. One of them was that I only exercised when I was starving, which means that I only exercised when my body wasn't really functioning properly. So it's no great shock looking back on it that that was really unpleasant. But the other thing that's more interesting is that I only saw exercise as transactional. Exercise was the thing that you did, even though you hated it, in order to get the thing that you really wanted, which was this thin body. I did make a resolution that I would exercise every day when I gave up dieting, because obviously there's lots and lots of evidence suggesting that exercise is really important for health. And I didn't want to not get those benefits. But in the beginning, I was taking sort of the same attitude to exercise that I had been during the years that I was dieting. I was doing it because it was good for me. I wasn't paying any attention to it. I had no expectation that it could be enjoyable in any way. It was just a thing you had to do. And although I still pretty much exercise every day, there's been a long-term subtle shift in the kinds of exercise that I do if they weren't good for me.
Right.
If they weren't physically healthy.
Right.
They're both just straight up enjoyable. They are things I want to do, not things that I have to do.
Right. How do you feel like you made that shift? Is it just time?
Yeah, it feels like it just kind of happened by itself, that this assumption that exercise had to be miserable fell away. And it required two things. It required not thinking of exercise as the price you pay and the attitude that I take toward it. I realized about a year ago that I am no longer doing anything that I hate for exercise. So I went from basically mostly walking, sometimes swimming, sometimes doing exercise bike at the gym, to now the vast majority of my exercise is dancing. And some of it is walking the dog. And both those things are fun. I'm much more relaxed about enjoying food than I used to be. I don't get these alarm bells going off of, oh, this is really delicious. Oh, better watch out, something bad's about to happen, that I used to have when I was dieting. I can just enjoy the food that I enjoy. And partly that's because of the other change, which is that I don't feel this compulsive need to keep eating things, either because they're really good or because, I have broken my diet and have to take full advantage of eating as much as I possibly can before the police come.
Right. Right.
I'm sure you know that feeling.
Yeah, for sure. What do you tell people, because I'm sure you get asked all the time, that have been on the dieting cycle for 30, 40 years? That I'm sure the process of what you did sounds scary. Do you have advice that you give to people?
I like something that Jean Christeller says to her mindful eating students when they first come in the door. She says, the first evening I tell them, I can't guarantee whether you'll lose weight or how much, but I can promise you that if you go through this process and learn how to eat in this way, that you will struggle much less with food, that there will be much more peace in your life surrounding the process of eating and making choices about eating.
I'm also curious about the conclusions you've made from reading the many studies about health and weight connections.
So there's a number of different studies now that show whether or not people are obese, that having a good lifestyle, eating healthy and exercising regularly and not smoking have a substantial impact on how long people live. So there was actually just a big study that came out a couple of weeks ago on deaths from cardiac disease, heart attacks and stuff, that showed that people, even if they remained obese, could reduce their risk of a heart attack by about half just by having a healthy diet and exercising regularly and not smoking.
How do they define a healthy diet in those studies? Do you know?
One of the main features of a healthy diet that everybody agrees on is that it involves a lot of vegetables. That would be my number one tip. If you could only change one thing in your diet, it would be that. My second piece of advice, avoid processed food.
What are the factors that kind of trick us to thinking we need to keep going on diets? Is that having to do with the culture around us, or is there parts of the brain that make that happen?
It's definitely cultural. There have been lots of societies, probably more societies over the course of human history, have believed that gaining weight was very attractive. The short form is that in every society, people want to do what the rich people do. So if you live in a world where food is hard to get and only rich people have enough food, then the rich people are going to be heavier than the poor people, and everybody's going to think that the heavier you are, the better you look. In our situation, it's kind of reversed because cheap food that's bad for you is easier to get if you're poor, and fruits and vegetables and personal trainers and so forth are easier to get if you're well off. So, the people that we look up to in our society have these very thin and fit bodies, but there's nothing intrinsic to the human condition that makes that admirable. That just happens to be the marker of high status in the society that we live in.
When we add to that, which I know you talk about in your book, when we add to that the industry and the money-making aspect of convincing people they need to be on diets or they should eat this delicious fast food. I mean, there's so many places that people are making money off of this pain people are in. Is there anything you want to add to about that?
It was kind of a revelation to me to realize that in many cases, the people who are encouraging us, paying for marketing that encourages us to overeat, and the people who are paying for marketing that encourages us to go on diets are actually the same people.
Yeah.
It's literally so the same companies that are responsible for making the food that you overeat and then the Diet Coke that you drink afterwards.
Do you have any other advice for people who are really struggling with food?
Well, everybody is going to be healthier if they eat better and exercise more, no matter where they start out. Now, obviously, for somebody who's a chronic dieter, but basically in good shape, that's not an emergency. And for somebody who is suffering from chronic disease and really struggling to walk around the block, it is an emergency. So you might very well take a different approach in counseling those people. One of them is mostly at risk of eating disorders, and the other one is mostly at risk of heart attacks and diabetes. But the interesting thing is that the prescription is much the same for both, which would be to get the best lifestyle that you can possibly put together and to do that first.
Because it seems the approach that most people have had, doctors included, over the past has been to put both of those people on some sort of diet. But statistically, we now know that that just makes both situations worse.
Yep. And the absolute worst thing that you can do in either case, and this happens all the time, is to just say, you are so bad. You are a terrible person. Now go home and fix that. And provide them with no further support at all. Because we know that hating your body leads to bad health behavior. We know that making these kinds of changes is difficult and requires a lot of mental energy, and that making these changes while also fighting with your brain about what your weight should be makes everything harder. I'm a big fan of doing the easy thing first. If you're not exercising, start exercising. Even if all you're doing is starting to exercise a little bit, 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day, whatever you can do something and commit to slowly increasing that over time.
Is there a piece of research around or statistic around exercising that is really compelling for you?
It's really an amazingly long list of advantages of exercise, all the way from the obvious, reducing the risk of heart attacks or diabetes, down to reducing the risk of recurring depression, reducing your risk of breaking bones when you're old. It's a very long list.
I really like what you said earlier about the key being finding places where you can really enjoy it and not have it be part of the diet mentality.
Right.
What new research that's out there is really exciting to you?
I probably at the moment point to the big study that just came out that I mentioned earlier about cardiac risks and lifestyle factors. It's the biggest and most comprehensive way of proving the point that I made in the book and the TED Talk, that what you do every day matters a lot more than the number on the scale in terms of your health and longevity.
I know you had your previous book that was about the children in their brain, right? Wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Welcome to Your Child's Brain.
Yes. Is there anything that you would say that speaks to both of these topics, like how to deal with children and this topic?
One of the things that's closest to my heart about all of this is trying to influence parents not to set their kids up for failure by trying to encourage them to restrict food, but to provide healthy food and let the kids eat it without a lot of drama. We Americans especially are really fond of family dinner drama, micromanaging exactly what our kids are allowed to eat and what they're required to eat. And there's a lot of research suggesting that kids who are allowed to make age-appropriate decisions, by which I mean, making a dinner entirely of chocolate cake is not on the list of approved options, but deciding that you want to eat this healthy food and not that healthy food is on the list of options, that those kids grow up generally thinner and healthier and eat better diets as adults than kids whose parents are constantly making a power struggle out of family mealtimes.
Yeah. Were you surprised by the success of your TED Talk?
It was interesting because I had been trying to book for a while before I did the TED Talk. And what I kept getting back was, oh, that's terrible news. Nobody wants to hear that. That's so depressing. And then I did the TED Talk, and it turned out lots and lots of people wanted to hear it.
So it seems we've seen the diet industry losing money for the first time in a long time. And I'm noticing a shift of language where you're using the word health a lot over the word diet. Any thoughts on this?
I think most of that is just attempts at rebranding now that the word diet has become compromised as these problems with it get to be more and more known. So there's a whole weird literature out there now of plans that are definitely not diets, but will definitely cause you to lose weight and keep it off. Ain't no such animal.
Yeah, that's so true. Well, thank you so much. Like I said, your book has been such an important part of me even wanting to do this podcast, so I really appreciate you spending time and talking with me.
Well, great. I'm glad.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for joining us today for this episode of Everybody. We're giving away a copy of Dr. Sandra Aamott's book this week on Instagram, so check us out at Everybody Podcast. And make sure to subscribe for next week's episode with Megan Crabb. She talks about her eating disorder and how body positivity and Instagram helped her recover. She also talks about the body positive movement and the problems with it. So until then, friends, talk to us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'd love to hear from you.